Hi, everyone. Welcome. Is the mic on and working? Thank you all for coming. Welcome to everybody. I'm Stephen Pitti, Professor of History and American Studies and Director of the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Program and Master of Ezra Stiles College. I want to issue a special welcome to Vice President Linda Lorimer and our other distinguished guests. Welcome to our home. Home is an important subject and concern that animates much of Richard Blanco's work. Describing a life of movement, he has said of himself that he was, quote, made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States. Richard grew up in Miami. He studied and worked as a civil engineer. He's lived in Brazil and Guatemala. He's authored 3 books of poetry. He's read and taught widely, including here in our state as a faculty member at Central Connecticut State University. And as you all know, he was recently named the 5th inaugural poet in the history of the United States. Unity and disunity, nostalgia and exile, the particulars of working class Miami, the household, the relationship between Spanish and English, these issues and others come forward in much of his work. But he engages too well beyond the confines of familiar terrain. He has said that the first poem he ever wrote in a graduate poetry course at Florida International University was on the broad topic, "What is America?" He's remarked that, quote, I am a writer who happens to be Cuban, but I reserve the right to write about anything I want, not just my cultural identity. Aesthetically and politically, I don't exclusively align myself with any one particular group, Latino, Cuban, gay, or white, but I embrace them all. Good writing is good writing. I like what I like. Well, audiences, what's that?
I think I stole that.
Audiences, reviewers, award committees, and leading elected officials also like what they like, and they've certainly admired Richard Blanco. Richard's writings have been celebrated in the awarding of major fellowships, a major book prize, and the inclusion of poems in major anthologies. His widely heralded poem, One Today, delivered at the inauguration on January 8, 2013, of course brought him to the attention of new audiences. His publications have received new acclaim in recent weeks, as has the fact that Richard was the youngest inaugural poet in US history, the first immigrant, the first Latino, and the first openly gay writer to receive that honor. So it's a real privilege to have Richard Blanco here in Ezra Stiles and at Yale University today. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Our second distinguished guest,
Sorry.
Elizabeth
I was
Alexander.
wondering what we were going to.
It's almost your turn. Our second distinguished guest, Elizabeth Alexander, is a poet, essayist, playwright, and the Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of African American Studies at Yale. She currently chairs the African American Studies department here at Yale. She's published 2 collections of essays, libretti for musical projects, and 6 books of poems, including American Sublime, which was one of 3 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. In 2009, Elizabeth composed and delivered Praise Song for the Day at the first inauguration of President Barack Obama, a poem that was simultaneously translated as Canto de Alabanza para el Día. On that day, Elizabeth urged all of us to, quote, say it plain, that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices they would then keep clean and work inside of. Widely anthologized, Elizabeth Alexander's work has been translated into many languages, including Spanish, German, Italian, Arabic, and Bengali. She was one of the first recipients of the Alphonse Fletcher Senior Fellowship for work that, quote, contributes to improving race relations in American society and furthers the broad social goals of the US Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954. In 2007, Elizabeth Alexander was awarded the first Jackson Prize for Poetry, and she was recently named an Anisfield Wolf Book Award winner for her lifetime achievement in poetry. Now, in January of 2009, we had the opportunity to host a discussion with Elizabeth Alexander immediately after her reading of the inaugural poem at the first inauguration. And we're thrilled to have her back and to provide this stage for Richard Blanco's first post-inauguration public appearance this year. So far as we know, this event marks the first time in which two inaugural poets have shared a stage together. And I want to thank our sponsors for making this happen: Ezra Stiles College, the Office of the President at Yale University, the African American Studies Department, the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Program, La Casa Cultural at Yale, the university's Office of Public Affairs, and Blue Flower Arts. Richard Blanco has agreed today to read for about 15 minutes. Elizabeth Alexander will then share her own thoughts and ask Richard some questions. And after that, we'll open up the floor to audience questions for some 15 or 20 minutes. So please join me in welcoming inaugural poets Richard Blanco and Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you, everyone. I apologize for my eagerness, but it felt like that day on that platform where I was like, "Come on, Kelly, hurry up! I want to get this over with already." It's an honor and a pleasure and a delight to be here. When Elizabeth first approached me with this idea, I just thought it was phenomenal. And like Master Pitti said, the first time in history where we actually get to have a conversation between these experiences. I'm really excited about what questions and answers you might have, more than my own reading, but I'm hoping we can also maybe get to the bottom of the Beyonce thing tonight, as I was there, okay? I know the truth. Anyway, I've picked a few poems, just 3 poems, and then the inaugural poem, 3 poems that I think are in some ways ancestors to the inaugural poem. One of those was what Master Pitti mentioned was the first poem I ever wrote, not ever, the first poem I wrote in a creative writing course, at my first creative writing course with Campbell McGrath. And the very first assignment in class was write a poem about America. So I'm going like, America? So I'm like thinking, what, daffodils? Like, and it really was almost fate that very first poem started me writing on that theme of cultural identity, cultural negotiation, and really asking what is America in my context. So one could say I've been writing about America for a long time, though that didn't make the inaugural poem much easier to write, but nonetheless, that's sort of the background. I felt a little more comfortable, I think, on that. So you should know 3 things for this poem, and it's a humorous poem somewhat, but for Cubans, pork is not the other white meat. It's the only meat. What was the other thing? Oh, we never really got Thanksgiving. We call it Sangiving, like San Ignacio or San Pedro, or Dia de Sangiving. And also, I think if the White House had ever read this line in here about Kennedy, I may not be here tonight. May not have been here tonight. It's not quoting me. That's what I heard. So anyway, and the poem is called America, or America. Although Tia Miriam boasted she discovered at least half a dozen uses for peanut butter, topping for guava shells and syrup, butter substitute for Cuban toast, hair conditioner and relaxer, my mom never knew what to make of the monthly 5-pound jars handed out by the immigration department until my friend Jeff mentioned jelly. There was always pork, though, for every birthday and wedding, whole ones on Christmas and New Year's Eve, even on Thanksgiving Day. Pork, fried, broiled, or crispy skin roasted, as well as cauldrons of black beans, fried plantain chips, and yuca con mojito. These items required a special visit to Antonio's Mercado on the corner of 8th Street, where men in guayaberas stood in Senate blaming Kennedy for everything. Ese hijo de puta. The bile of Cuban coffee and cigar residue filling the creases of their wrinkled lips, clinging to one another's lies of lost wealth, ashamed and empty as hollow trees. By 7, I had grown suspicious. We were still here. Overheard conversations about returning had grown wistful and less frequent. I spoke English. My parents didn't. We didn't live in a 2-story house with a maid or wood panel station wagon, nor vacation camping in Colorado. None of the girls had hair of gold. None of my brothers or cousins were named Greg, Peter, or Marcia. We were not the Brady Bunch. None of the black and white characters on Donna Reed or the Dick Van Dyke Show were named Guadalupe, Lázaro, Mercedes. Patty Duke's family wasn't like us either. They didn't have pork on Thanksgiving. They ate turkey with cranberry sauce. They didn't have yuca. They had yams, like the dittos of pilgrims I colored in class. A week before Thanksgiving, I explained to my abuelita about the Indians and the Mayflower, how Lincoln set the slaves free. I explained to my parents about the Purple Mountain's majesty, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, the cherry tree, the tea party, the amber waves of grain, the masses yearning to be free, liberty and justice for all, until finally they agreed this Thanksgiving we would have turkey, as well as pork. Abuelita prepared the poor fowl as if committing an act of treason, faking her enthusiasm for my sake. Mama set a frozen pumpkin pie in the oven and prepared candied yams following instructions I translated from the marshmallow bag. The table was arrayed with gladiolas. The plattered turkey loomed at the center on plastic silver from Woolworths. Everyone sat in green velvet chairs we had upholstered with clear vinyl, except Tio Carlos and Toti, seated in the folding chairs from the Salvation Army. I uttered a bilingual blessing, and the turkey was passed around like a game of Russian roulette. Dry, Gilberto complained, and proceeded to drown the lean slices with pork fat drippings and cranberry jelly. Esa mierda roja, as he called it. Faces fell when Mama presented her ochre pie. Pumpkin was a home remedy for ulcers, not a dessert. Tia Maria made 3 rounds of Cuban coffee, then Abuelo and Pepe cleared the living room furniture, put on a Celia Cruz LP, and the entire family began to merengue over the linoleum of our apartment, sweating rum and coffee until they remembered. It was 1970 and 46 degrees in America. After repositioning the furniture, an appropriate darkness filled the room. Gilberto was the last one to leave. If you remember the inaugural poem, there were 2 very distinct autobiographical moments or references. One was to my mother, one was to my father. And I thought for today, I'd give you a little sort of a sneak, a peek behind the curtains, or let you know them a little bit better by reading a poem, one of them each, which are as an immigrant exile family, from an immigrant exile family life is front and center in many of my poems. This one particularly about my mother, whom I revere for several reasons, and I'm at odds for several reasons as well, but the courage, I keep on fathoming the courage it takes, and this is one of the inaugural poems I worked on of the 3 that I had to write, but the courage it took to leave everything you know, every single cousin, your parents, every single brother, every single sister, every single cousin, niece, aunt, nephew, every playground you ever played in, every street you ever knew, and hop on a plane and turn around and say goodbye. Never really knowing that at that time that if you were ever going to be able to come back, and all for the sake of one, love for my father, to follow my father, but also for a better life, which is the immigrant story, of course, for my brother and I. And something my brother and I just constantly, whenever we get really mad at her, we think about that moment and that incredible courage. And this is a portrait of her, sort of a more recent portrait of her, where I think she's reached a really wonderful space in her life after all that suffering and loss. Venus in Miami Beach. What calls her to the sea? She rises, steps towards the shore with the temperament of a bride. Her shadow, a long train pulled across the sand behind her, parting a flock of seagulls screeching away into the wind. Her swollen ankles and frail shoulders disappear inch by inch under her body as she wades into the water, becoming as young as I remember her in a photo, posing like a mermaid for my father. Once as gorgeous as her name, Hesa. Once a girl chasing fireflies who hadn't lost her home and country, sisters and husband. Once a mother who watched me as I watch her now, afraid of her alone with the sea. I wave to her, but she turns away from me, fixes her eyes on the horizon and beyond, at nothing I can see. Needing no one, it seems. Like Venus's gaze, I'm tempted to think, born full grown out of the sea. But today, she's not a goddess or a girl, not even my mother, but simply a her, floating in the circle of her own arms, a water lily, tranquil and sure of her being. And this last portrait before we get to the inaugural is of my father, but really about more of my father's relationship, which is somewhat typical for the Latino generation of that time, a very silent relationship. I think the administration forgot another first, which was the first engineer to read that poem. I should have reminded them about that. So this poem also it gives you a little bit of sort of a little peek at my engineering side and my career as an engineer, which I think will not be happening from now on. So finally I had God chose for me, I think. So anyway, it's called Papa's Bridge. Morning, driving west again, away from the sun rising in the slit of the rearview mirror, as I climb on slabs of concrete and steel bent into a bridge, aching with all its parabolic Y-squared splendor. I rise to meet the shimmering faces of buildings, above treetops meshed into a calico of greens, forgetting the river below runs, insists on running and scouring the earth, moving it grain by grain. And for a few inclined seconds every morning, I am 12 years old again, with my father standing on the 10th floor window of his hospital room, gazing at this same bridge like a mammoth bone, aching with the gravity of its own dense weight. The glass dosed by a tepid light reviving the city, as I watched and read his sleeping, wondering if he could even dream in such dreamless white. Was he falling? Was he flying? Was he falling? Was he flying? Who was he? Who was I underneath his eyelids, flitting like the birds across rooftops and early morning stars wasting away? The rush hour cars pushing through the avenues like the tiny blood cells through his vein, the IV spiraling down like a string of clear licorice feeding his forearm, bruised pearl and lavender, colors of the morning haze, and the pills on his tongue. The stitches healed while the room kept sterile with the usual silence between us. For 3 days, I served in water or juice in wilting paper cups, flipped through muted soap operas and game shows, filled out menu cards stamped bland diet. For 3 nights, I wedged flat, strange pillows around his bed, his body shaped like a fallen S and mortared in place by layers of stiff percale. When he was ordered to walk, I took his hand. Together, we stepped to the window, and he spoke. You'll know how to build bridges like that someday. Today, I cross this city, this bridge, still spanning the silent distance between us, with the memory of a father and son holding hands and secretly in love. And now for the inaugural, which I've been asked in a lot of interviews, how did you, I don't know if Elizabeth had one, I don't want to preempt our conversation, but I've been asked, like, how did you get up there with all those people, you know? And actually, you don't really see it in your face when you're up there. So actually, this is actually much more welcoming and intimate, but it's also you're also sort of much more exposed. But I did want to say, I want to leave some things for question and answer, but I did want to say a couple things. And one was, I don't know if you've picked up this already from reading the poem, but parts of the inspirations or the genesis of the poem. And of course, I went back to Maya and Elizabeth's poem, and I liked the shorthand that you kind of need to write this poem, which was sort of relying on symbols of nature, and sort of took that, I think, from Maya, as I look back in retrospect, of course. And from Elizabeth's poem, that catalog of people was just something so delightful, and I wanted to work with that. And I also realized, I don't know if this happened with Elizabeth, it's not just you writing that poem. There's almost like, there has to be some kind of continuity that you're looking at, almost like a subgenre of the poetry, because it's something none of us have, we get to ask, so few of us get asked to do, and it's not something you do in the course of being a poet all the time, this sort of celebration of America or some in that context. So I feel like there's also a lineage of something that you have to pay homage to, and so I wanted to say that to this group because I thought it was very important that you know that. And also holding on to, I think, the sort of spiritual genesis of the poem was certain fundamental beliefs that I've held for a long time, and I think that comes from a tight-knit exile immigrant community, and that's the idea of the importance of the individual within that community and what they contribute to it, and how it takes everyone in that community to make it work. And when you think that as just sort of, I think I took that to a larger degree and look at our country and our quality of life and how everyone is interconnected, not just spiritually in the Zen-like way, but also in a very practical manner as well, how we all need to work together in many ways to make everything work. And the respect that I think is due, and something that was instilled in me perhaps by my mother, the respect that is due to each and every one of us, no matter what walk of life you come from, no matter what's going on. The idea, yes, it's hard economic times, but respect is respect and honor, no matter where we're at. So anyway, those were some of the things. Of course, this I look back in retrospect and see where some of these things came from in the creative process. It's so much subconscious stuff is going on. So I'll read this, and then we can get on to the conversation. Did you have water? That's all right. Oh, great. Yeah, this is getting long poems. Oh, thanks, Steve. One today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging across the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story told by silent gestures moving behind windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges arrayed like rainbows, begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way, to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives. to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years so I could write this poem for us today. All of us. As vital as the one light we move through, the same light on blackboards with lessons for the day, equations to solve, history to question, or atoms imagined, the I have a dream we keep dreaming, or the impossible vocabulary of sorrow that won't explain, the empty desks of 20 children marked absent today and forever. Many prayers, but one light, breathing color into stained glass windows, life into the faces of bronze statues, warmth onto the steps of our museums and park benches as mothers watch children slide into the day. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands, hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops that keep us warm, hands digging trenches, routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's cutting sugarcane so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of our farms and deserts, cities and plains, mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Hear squeaky playground swings, trains whistling or whispers across cafe tables. Hear the doors we open for each other all day, saying hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias, in the language my mother taught me, in every language, spoken into one wind carrying our lives without prejudice, as these words break from my lips. One sky. Since the Appalachians and Sierras claimed their majesty, and the Mississippi and Colorado worked their way to the sea, thank the work of our hands, weaving steel into bridges, finishing one more report for the boss on time, stitching another wound or uniform, the first brushstroke on a portrait, or the last floor on the Freedom Tower, jutting into a sky that yields to our resilience. One sky toward which we sometimes lift our eyes, tired from work. Some days guessing at the weather of our lives, some days giving thanks for a love that loves you back. Sometimes praising a mother who knew how to give, or forgiving a father who couldn't give what you wanted. We head home through the gloss of rain or weight of snow or the plum blush of dusk, but always, always home. Always under one sky, our sky, and always one moon. Like a silent drum tapping on every rooftop and every window of one country, all of us, facing the stars, hope, a new constellation, waiting for us to map it, waiting for us to name it together. Thank you. Let's have at it. Thanks. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you,
was so
Elizabeth, for having me.
beautiful. That was so beautiful. And you talked about this, but I want to know how that felt, because going into your reading, you talked about, and I think we saw one of the great accomplishments of the poem is that it was on the grand scale. I mean, it was a big poem, as was called for. It had sweep and grandeur, but it was incredibly intimate. And you know, I remember thinking, oh, I can never, the poem was built for that. It wasn't built for this. But actually it just becomes something else when it's in different spaces. So I just wonder how it felt to read it here.
Oh, actually, it felt much more connected, actually, with an audience, because as I was saying before, you see the sea of people, and you're not sure, you know, what's going on. I mean, you feel intimate on the platform, and one of my moments was when I was walking back, and actually James Taylor tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Nice." I was like, all right, I can die now. But what I did feel intimately, I mean, this is obviously, you know, a much more sort of face-to-face connection that makes the poem even more alive for me at this point. You know, it's like, it's still, you get off that podium and you're not sure how it went over, you know, exactly, right? And
you can never know.
And yeah, it's like, it's you know, you get feedback later and things like that, but at that moment, you're not sure exactly how it goes, and I just remember turning to my mother and just saying, "Well, Mom, I think we're finally American." And one of the sweet things, and I think I've mentioned this, is that as I went up to the podium, both president and vice president stood up to greet me, which I wasn't expecting. I don't know if that's the protocol or whatnot. So that gave me like an extra sort of sense of welcome, like almost like, here, read the poem, so which I think gave me a lot of courage. But I tell you, it was. Well, I don't know if that was your experience. We had also had a sound check, so I was used to that view. But you don't have, you know, I don't see the faces. So in a way, the more intimate things are, the more you're exposed, right? So I felt a little less exposed, actually, if you think about it, with 800,000 people than I do right now.
Well, it's very, very beautiful. And I'm glad also that you read poems that you think of as ancestors, because I wanted to know if you thought of this poem as something kind of out of your body of work, or if it feels like a, you know, brother or a distant relation to your other poems.
Well, one of the big learning experiences, and one of the really big hurdles I had in writing the poem was, as you saw with my mother and father poem, I'm used to writing about very sort of familiar and intimate subjects. And I kept on thinking, well, I know it can't be that poem, but how do you apply your same voice to this poem? And all the while I thought my poetry was received because of what I wrote about. And then I started looking at it as, no, it's how you write about what you're writing about. And once that clicked, I said, I'll just try to apply that same sort of dense imagery and intimate voice to some other subject matter. And that was a big leap. And to answer your question further, I think it opened up something that I was very scared to do. Yeah, I've been asking all these questions about America, but always sort of in the confines of my immediate sort of ethnic exile community experience. And now it gave me courage to sort of explore America in another way that I hadn't seen, so I could see it almost as a beginning. It's still a little bit more of like a cousin right now, as you saw, compared to the others. But I'm excited about going out and writing about America in different ways that I hadn't thought about before, and doing this poem gave me the assignment, the opportunity, and the courage. So.
That's wonderful, because I think, yeah, there's something about it's the movement in your poems and the way they start in very, very intimate spaces. I loved reading that you cleared out your workspace to write this poem, and you wrote it at the kitchen table, where all important things happen. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, actually.
Yeah, that's where you do it. You know, I mean, that's where life is, and that's where I feel like if there is a place in your poems, metaphorically, you know, what emanates from the kitchen table is kind of where you are. But then from that intimacy, we move out, but very gracefully, very quietly. So I think that actually you made movement that seemed familiar to me from other poems, and that's a great strength.
Thank you.
So our mutual dear friend, Campbell McGrath, your teacher, my high school classmate.
All right. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, we were in the same high school class.
Okay.
Isn't that crazy? And he's the first person who told me about your work. He always has been a very, very proud teacher.
Yeah.
And so I loved, and I think perhaps it was that America poem where, you know, the first poem you wrote in his class went right into your book.
It's the first poem in the first book.
And he said it just came out, and there it was, and there you were, and you were doing what you were supposed to be doing. But he also said, as you know, that he thinks that you brought your engineer brain, that there was something about structure that you understood very intrinsically that was manifest in the poems. Could you say more about that?
Well, I think it happens this way. I think it works for and against me at times. But when I'm in pure creative mode, I have to let go of that a little bit, to just let words come in images and not have the idea that I have to structure it or whatnot. And then once I get sort of some raw material on paper or something that's closer to a draft, then where the engineer comes in is as the editor and starts looking at sort of logic and patterns and language and how things are connected. And as he has always said, I just become this ruthless editor at that point. I'm just like, okay, the bridge can't be this way. It's going to fall apart. And so it gives me that detachment when the left brain kicks in, and it's just sort of looking at it almost from a more analytical point of view. By the same token, sometimes I overdo that. And so if you'll notice any of my poems, just aesthetically, visually on the page, I don't like, all the line breaks have to be kind of about the same length. If I write a 10-line stanza and the next line is 9 lines, I'm like, yeah, we gotta get, really makes me uncomfortable because I like patterns, I like, algorithms, things that can replicate and sort of have this visual dimension to them. So that's where the engineer comes in, and I've always felt all my life I need to do both in some ways. At some point during the process of writing the poem, I had to do a spreadsheet. I had to do something analytical to let the other side of the brain rest and then come back in and not look at it. It's like kind of I have to entertain one and make them go away while this one's, and then I got to make this one go away while the other one works. But it's the way I was wired. My dad obviously influenced me to study engineering, but I was very good at math, and I was kind of a B student in most things, which made it hard to decide. And at first I thought it was a sort of a negative mark on me that I was an engineer, and then I realized this, most people are asking me, "Oh, you're an engineer," and I was like, "Oh, this could be a compliment, actually."
Yeah, and I think also, there are always these kind of sub rosa ways of organizing that you can articulate it, but it also is at work in a way that is. We want these poems to hold together.
Right.
Although
right.
I think also what's really nice is that in most of your poems, there's a moment of break or not resolution. In the poems that you read, the endings do not resolve.
Right.
And I think that also that moment in the middle of the inaugural poem where you say, breathe,
Right.
and where you stop and you give us all that moment, which actually I appreciated because I was sitting there watching you not breathing and just, watching you like your sister or something, and then say, okay, fine, everything's fine. But I think that that's actually something that is a wonderful counter to all of that nice wire.
Yeah, I gotta, and then those are the moments I have to remember to the engineer wants to resolve everything and sort of tie everything up nice and neatly, and sometimes that's where I have to come back somewhere in the middle and say, okay, leave it. There's, more in between the lines than there are in the lines sometimes. So.
And I wonder also about, we were talking a little bit in the kitchen about Spanish, and I was trying to think about, I've decided I don't like the word Spanglish as a way of sort of describing what it means to have more than one language to call upon, what that incredibly complex mixture of having all of it at your disposal is all about. That there are things that can be done in Spanish that can't be done in English, and vice versa. And so I wonder how that, if you could talk some about that, and about how that affects your poetics.
Well, I've in most of my books, there's at least one or two examples of where I'll write a poem that either topically I feel I need to translate into Spanish, and also poems that I write first come to me in Spanish and I translate into English, and this is only something you can do with your own work, but like you were saying, things that don't work, and then there are different modes of thinking because it's another language. So when it doesn't work on one language, I'll go back to the original language and sort of see if what I came up with in the Spanish will work in the English, and then I change the English, and then it works in the Spanish. And so the poem looks like a literal translation, but really they were worked out together. And I find that helps the poem because it breathes something else into the poem from another language that makes me think of another way, or just sounds and things like that. We're working with a translator now officially for the other two poems that I had to write. And I'm finding out from this translating world that gerunds in Spanish are like taboo, ugly, nobody likes them. And I'm like a gerund freak, you know? So I've had to battle with it. I was like, that doesn't sound right to me. And like she's like saying, and it made me understand. And then I actually went back a little bit and teased with some of those. Okay, maybe if this was in a present tense, it would actually work like it does in Spanish. But it gives you access to sort of almost workshop your own poem in another language kind of thing. And sometimes I'll think, how does this line, sometimes just out of the blue, I'll think, how does this line sound in Spanish? And I'll say it to myself in Spanish. And I was like, yeah, that looks nice. And let me do that in English. You know?
Yeah, I think also there are the people that you bring in with Spanish in the poems. And you've talked about, those family members who are getting older and how that became an impetus for some aspects of your poetry, and how you wanted them to, it was a beautiful thing that you said that you want to make them live forever on paper as you yourself want to live forever on paper. And I think that, you're not a nostalgist, but you are trying to capture something that is fleeting and precious. And in the language, it seems to me that that's one way that you can do that, because you couldn't have translated that uncle's line about Kennedy, and it wouldn't have done what, or
Yeah, there's pieces of them in there. Yeah, there's pieces of them in there, and that's something I get from Campbell actually a lot is that sense of being as the poet, as a historian in a way, an emotional historian, and a lot of the inspiration for the first book was to sort of record emotionally this first, the sort of yearnings and contradictions and things that this first Cuban American generation went through, because they were going to be gone. There's only one first bridge generation, and so that's always remained with me in that aspect of recording emotions as almost like a historian, as a historical document. And that's what I love about. I wish it was law that they had to write an inaugural poem at every inauguration, because it takes a snapshot emotionally of where the country is in each, at least every 4 years, and some years it's been too far and too between that. But I love how you can take Robert's Frost and see where the country was there, and then your poem and see where we were there, and hopefully there'll be others, and it's almost like I said, like a subgenre of these snapshots. So a lot of my inspiration is that recording of that emotional history, and paying tribute to our ancestors, people that come before us, and like it says in there, I'm here because of these people. I mean, that was one of the first things when I heard the news, after I called a few people to make sure they weren't playing a practical joke on me. I had to pull over and sit on the side of the road and basically weep. And then the first people I thought about were my grandparents, my parents, and I took a photo with me. The only thing I took in that binder was a painted photograph of my great-grandparents, whom I've never met, obviously, and they were there with me.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And that's who I was sort of reading to.
And you were with your mom.
And with my mom, of course.
Yeah, I was with my dad, and
oh yeah,
and my husband had said he goes up there because the world needs to see the white hair, and really, I mean, in a very profound way, that it's not just about who our generation is in the present. It's about the elders, and it's about how we got there, and so I think it's so beautiful that
my partner actually insisted that my mother go to. Which was a great act of love too. Like he just felt that sense too of like, that's the most appropriate person at that moment.
Yep. And then what about, so many identities we have, right? And except the youngest, we have to change that because I was only 2 years older than you at the time. So that needs to be over completely. Let it be said for the media. But you're a Florida poet too. And I think that your poetry, I think about Elizabeth Bishop's, The State with the Prettiest Name,
Yeah.
Afloat in Brackish Water, and,
Yeah.
Campbell's Florida poems, and just all of the Florida poems, and your Florida poem talking to those. Can you talk some about that? Or maybe it's not even Florida, it's Miami.
It's mostly Miami, and it's something that I think in the third book I'm starting to deal with a lot. Again, that sense of home and of place and identity, which obsesses me. And the Miami I grew up in is certainly not the Miami of today. And it's almost like I say, it's like my Cuba. I go there and I'm lost, and I go to the restaurant, it's a condo building, I go somewhere else, it's some fancy schmancy the other. And I feel like I've been erased from the landscape, or my memory has been erased. And I feel like the way my parents go, my mother would go to Cuba, and they'd start complaining about how dare they change the name of that street, and like this kind of stuff. And I found myself with the same nostalgic sort of like apprehension and rant about, and that's where Looking for the Gulf Motel came from, as I went back to Marco Island after 20 years. I'm like, what's going on here? And so, it's all in that mix, because there's home is a state of mind, but it's also a physical environment. It's also the streets we walk through, the stores we go into. And to parallel that with my engineering, one of the things that I specialize in is called urban redevelopment, or streetscaping, or villagifying things, where we went into certain places in Miami and just basically redid a makeover of the town to make them more walkable, bring them up to date. And I have one poem about that I read in my hard hat once at the groundbreaking ceremony. But it occurred to me, I'm changing the landscape that I'm complaining about. That people are changing. I'm like, the people that know the street for what it is, they're going to be like, what'd they do that for? So I feel attachment to place, and that's why I travel a lot and have lived in different places, is trying to find that connection, not just spiritually and emotionally, but that the actual landscape that influences us so much in how we feel, the architecture, all the other arts that surround us in that sense, and community, which is important. And now I'm in Bethel, Maine.
Go figure. Well, there are many questions for you here, but I have one more that I must ask. I have many more. Chisme, Beyonce. I need to know everything. I need to know, how is she 10 feet tall? How tall was her hair off of her head? Was it a wig? I want to know everything. So
she was pretty. I mean, she was about my height, so that's pretty tall for female, right? And I thought, I first tried to sneak in to see her with my friend Nikki, and her people were like, "No, you can't." So then.
So you mean she was in the Capitol?
Yeah, during the sound
Yeah.
check. Then after that, all I remember was seeing her. She had that ear thing, which looked like an IV actually. and then you, as you know, up there, you can't really hear too much when you're up there, because it's all meant to project that way. And so I was just like, I don't know the story exactly, but afterwards, she liked the poem, and she asked for an appearance, for an audience for me.
Wow.
So I went to see her, and she was just like, she was a nervous wreck like me. Like we were talking about, even Kelly Clarkson, when she came back from the aisle, she was like, "Oh my God, that was so nerve-wracking." And that's when I said, if they're nerve-wracked, I can do this. This is normal to be nerve-wracked at this point. And she seemed very nice and natural. And then I found the gossip later and all this stuff. And then I think someone quoted me as saying, I didn't lip sync my poem. Because it was a loaded question. It was an interviewer said, would you have lip synced your poem if you could? And I'm like, what's this guy asking me? And I answered very earnestly, well, you can't really, because, all he wanted me to say was like, I wouldn't lip sync my poem. But she seemed very genuine and sweet, and what was so surprising was that she was nervous, like all of us, and what was even more, and I don't know if Elizabeth, you got the sense of there, all the while I have never been quite a patriotic person, but I've always held America up to those beliefs that I learned in grade school. Somewhere in the back of my mind there was always those ideals. When I was sitting on that platform, at least for those 2 hours, and I don't know if this is because I'm a poet or I was still in my poem, there was those fundamental ideas for those 2 hours still held. It was like we can't, and you know, why we get jaded and we think and all the things that are going on. And for those 2 hours, Beyonce and me and James Taylor and all the rest are here for one purpose only. And they felt that honor, and you feel that for those 2 hours, won today. I mean, it really felt that energy. And I never embraced America fully until that moment. And I realized that those very ideals that I thought were just things in picture books and, you know, fancy words, they're still there somehow. And it was like, it brought tears to my eyes. I was like, they're still there. We haven't been able to erase that, no matter what, you know, it looks like on media or what it looks like. And it was such an amazing experience when I turned my mind. I said, I think I'm finally American. You know, I finally embraced something that I hadn't embraced at some point.
Yeah, I thought about that. I felt that it was rather a small platform to hold the entire government.
Yeah,
you
felt
know?
intimate in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so that you know, everyone is there, and of course, in the case of the first one, power was being transferred.
Yeah, which is even more.
And it was happening peacefully, and it would happen, and it did happen. And that everyone was there to bear witness, and everyone was there in some kind of collectivity. And being in the crowd this time, I also, and I kept saying, oh, it's so different. Oh, I'm so relaxed. Oh, this is so great. But I looked back at all the people from the ground and thought, you know, oh, this is what common ground means.
Yeah,
you know, this is what it means that all of these people have chosen to gather as far as the eye can see, you know, for common purpose, despite all of the differences. And it is amazing.
It's amazing. It's just like, it's like an ideal brought to life in that very experience. That was amazing. Yeah, with you, I mean, that was the real transfer of power. That must have been like even more present.
It was, yeah, you know, it was not quite totally believable because there was all of the, you know, people didn't think it would happen in their lifetime. You know, so there was that real, I'm not sure people thought it would actually happen.
Right, it can sunk in.
Really, I mean, I felt on the stage a collective exhalation. And there were a lot of elders on that stage when it finally happened and it was finally true. And that was something else.
That was amazing. I mean, it's an amazing experience, and I'm such a fan. I want to go to every inauguration now too. You know, like to take that breather. You know, to take that moment, and say, let's pause and do this, and support that idea. You know, that we do this, and it's not a joke. It's not. Yeah, there's a lot of fluff in it, but it's not. I mean, it is not just pomp and circumstance. If you read the oath, I don't know, I went back and read the oath. I mean, those words are very significant. And it's like, that I come here not under duress and all this other stuff. And it's like amazing. Like, anyway, now I'm like, I don't want to run for office or something.
Well, you are now the ambassador of American poetry. And so I know I said that was the last question, but I just want to say that I was so proud of you. And I think that, you know, there was a way that American poets were with you because you represented us.
Right.
Up
That's
there.
another piece of it,
And we got to be there, and we're not there a lot, though we do what we do. And so I wondered how you feel, you know, as a poet amongst others.
I think it's something I've always craved in the sense of, I consider my work very accessible, and I think I write, or my subject matters have always been sort of salt of the earth people, and I've always sort of struggled with, you know, I want the people in my poems to be the ones reading my poems as well, while yet maintaining, you know, certain aesthetic and quality of craft and whatnot, and sometimes that's hard to do. And so that connection with such a large and diverse audience, and what happened afterward in the city was amazing, was more amazing than the actual event. It was, like, I'll never forget this doorman at a hotel that I was meeting someone, I don't know what. He just looked at me and took my hand. He said, "Give me some love." And he just hugged me. He didn't even ask me who. He just recognized me. And this little Asian American lady who came out, I don't know where she came out of, an alley. I don't know where she just popped out, barely spoke English, so I'm not even sure. She had a little autograph book, and she wanted me to sign. She gave me this big hug, and like, I mean, if poetry can do that, let's do that. As I said, let's make this law.
Yeah, that's right.
And the other piece that happened, Maine Magazine had recently asked me to publish a poem about 7 months ago, and then the editor took out the poetry page. I was like, okay, whatever. And now they're putting the poetry page back in. and they wrote me, and the editor said, thank you for saving poetry again, because of the exposure that brings to everyone else, and to feel that poetry can connect in the ways that we always hope, but we don't get those audiences or those opportunities once, maybe not even once in a life for us, maybe once in a lifetime, but it's difficult. It's hard because your heart is so much in everything around you, and sometimes poetry can be such a closeted art,
Well, others have questions.
Do you want to be moderator? I'm horrible at it.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, go
All right,
ahead. Pick.
So I'm curious how you chose to balance particular and universal images in the inaugural poem, and that you spoke a little bit about sort of the particular experience, your particular experience versus general American experience. I'm curious more about sort of the like the images of one moon, one light, one land could be interpreted as more universal than just like one American land, one American light. So how did you decide, or how did you turn those possible universal symbols into American symbols, and how did you decide to do that?
Part of it, maybe I didn't say well enough, but part of it is you need some kind of shorthand, right? Or some kind of glue that sort of bonds these catalogs of images together for me. And I took a cue from Maya's poem with the rock, the tree, the river. And so I thought that nature is such a powerful sort of encompassing thing, and I thought that'll be the glue, both as an image in the sense that we all look at one sun, we all look at one moon, we all breathe one air, figuratively. And then to counterbalance that, I thought I need some very specific moments of imagery. And then to counter that, I said I always had to feel like I needed to put a little bit of my own autobiographical piece in there, which was very scary to do, and I had a lot more that I took out, and that was kind of how I mapped it. I had wanted to. I kept on focusing on this theme of, this idea, as I said, that a belief that I've held is like how we all have to work together for very practical and spiritual reasons, but I couldn't find that one thing to put it to. That constant reference point, and then it became those powerful elements of nature that are so eternal and primordial. So.
You also have the sequence about the possible vocabulary of sorrow. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to include something that was very current in the poem?
Yeah, that was happening while I was reading the poem, and as it was for all of us, such an amazing moment. I still get misty, and it just felt completely right to do that, and to have that recorded forever, hopefully in this poem. I felt it was a moment that, and there have been, of course, other tragedies where America comes together, and I felt, well, I didn't want to catalog too many tragedies in the poem, and I thought if anything was most appropriate was that moment, which felt right in the way because it happened while I was writing the poem. But also in the sense that I also wanted a contemporary sense to the poem, in the sense that there were some poems when I started back at the Pilgrims, and and it was like 8 pages now. And so because that was so of the moment, and because I think a lot of the images, I had to sort of focus on, okay, in a sense, I hear America singing, what does that sound like today? And try to find some boundary, right? Because I mean, it's the subject matters and the historical references, and in my case, having to sort of the pressure feeling I have to also make particular references to what I'm representing as a person, were overwhelming, and so I had to find some boundaries to the poem, but it just felt just so right for me. I had more specific reference in it, actually naming the town. I took that out because I wanted some graduate students someday to have to look at that. What do you mean by the 20? So I put the 20 just to acknowledge it, but not be so obvious and not feel like gratuitously including something for the sake of value, shock value or tear-jerking value, but rather it was really honestly just wanting to have that recorded for that moment. And I went through the emotional process while I was writing the poem with all that. I mean, I was like, I had to limit my viewing of it actually, because it was too much. And I've always worked, I can go on forever, stick a Cuban up here. I've worked a lot with kids, and about 2 weeks earlier I was in Wilton, Connecticut with an 8th grade class, and I think that was part of it, teaching them the Gulf Motel, and there was just like 8 periods of 8th graders, which had me a wreck by the end of the day, but they are so amazing, like the things that they were getting from poetry. And I think that was also fresh in my mind, that connection with the children.
Fingers here.
Yep. So first of all, we were so proud to have you up there on the stage. As you heard, there were about 200 of us that went to the inauguration. It was great to see you there. My question is, you mentioned that you had to write a couple of other poems. I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about the process. How do you get selected, and how does that happen?
I'm curious to ask Elizabeth, did they ask you to write 3 as well?
They didn't, and I think that it was, yeah, I know. You know what, someone else might have done it if they'd asked me to write 3, because 1 was enough. I don't know how you did 3, oh my God. But I think also we were speaking about this, like nobody knew what they were doing. I mean, oh my God, he just won the election, let's put on an inaugural.
Right.
It was very put together, so
yeah.
that's a new rule.
I think maybe because it was such a short span, if I would have written a poem that maybe they wouldn't have liked, I thought maybe they wanted to sort of stagger their bets, I think, and say, well, they're between 3. But they weren't like, you have to write 3. They said, we want 3, 2 to 3 weeks I had for 3 poems. So right, it gives a new meaning to the timed writing exercise. But I was glad they didn't tell me 6 months ago, because I would have I would have pulled all my hair out, and 6 months sitting on that. So 2 weeks more would have been a little better. But the other 2 poems are completely different aspects of what I did, and I'm working on them because I want to publish them together as a trio. As a triptych. One is very focused on my mother, and it allowed me to do the autobiographical American experience poem through her story, and I needed to write that too. And I knew they weren't going to pick that one, but I wrote it. And then the other one is more of a metaphorical, but using one of the things I've always felt about my relationship with a country, that it's much like a romantic relationship, that there's the phase of the innocence when you're a little kid, and then there's like, you're like da 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 da, and like you're kind of going about high school and worrying where you're gonna get a beer, and then their eyes, the shades part open, and you're like, oh my God, and then you really look into history, and you go through this rage period with your country, and the injustices, and how could America have done that, and you feel like the sense of betrayal when you sort of start picking at history a lot. And then at some point you also realize this sort of, well, so do other countries. That nothing is perfect, and that you try to work away, you try to sort of work it out, and that often is where you decide to work with a group of people, or you start being an activist or something like that. But it's that dialogue that begins just like in a relationship, where like, are we gonna give this up here, or are we gonna sit around at the kitchen table and talk this out, because we need to talk. And that ends up in eventually a more long-lasting bond with your country that is not the romantic sense of, anyway, I'm giving away too much of it, but I tried to trace that in a poem, that sort of looking at America as almost personifying America in some way, as a relationship that we have with love, and with loved ones, and with others.
Other questions or comments?
We got one, and then you.
Hi. I just want to say how inspiring just your words in this room have been today. And if you could say something or a small something to aspiring poets in the room, what would you say to us?
I think what I find missing in Hour for Elizabeth feels the same is to try to find something you really care about. And I think that's really the secret to where the writing develops, something that obsesses you. I know for me, before I wrote America, I was writing god-awful poems. I mean, I thought I had to write like Wordsworth, and and I was writing about daffodils that I didn't know what it looked like in Miami. They don't have daffodils. But to find something that really is, that you have something personally at stake at, and that's something you've made up your mind about. Because if you've made up your mind about something, there's nothing to explore in writing. But rather to approach something that you feel you need to understand about yourself, and you need to understand it for others. And again, that sense of emotional historian, that it's something larger than yourself at the same time as it's very intimate. For me, it was my Cuban American generation that I felt I needed to have them have a voice. For me, it's my family, and in some ways, it's always been about America, in a roundabout way. That goes with all the rest of you got to go to workshop, you got to put your best foot forward, you got to take the good with the bad, the feedback, and all that. But I think that's from here. You got to in workshop. It's so easy to start here and get lost up here. In fact, the revision of one of the 3 poems ended up in that god-awful wasteland of this benign poem. I workshopped the magic completely out of it, and I started all over again with the original version and then merged them. So I mean that goes without saying, but that sense of, I think that's the hardest thing that you can't learn in a classroom, is like that thing. Look for that thing.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on that same question?
Advice to poets? What I would add on to that thing is that not everybody does, or can. It's actually a very, very sacred, special thing. Each of us does have our own sacred, special thing. It's not poetry for everyone. And so I think that, if it's yours, tend it. Really, really, really tend it. And part of what tending it means is continually reading and understanding yourself as making poems on a very long timeline that also has spokes that go all the way around the world. And so, you're part of poets across history and poets around the globe. And you're a dot in that conversation. And you have to know what's in that conversation. I think that's really important.
We have time for one final question, if there are any. Maybe in the back. Yes, Derek.
I didn't realize you were an engineer before, and so I really appreciated that you were an engineer and now a poet, and that you bring the strengths from engineering into how you write poetry. I'm a science major, and over the summer I took an English course and had a really great experience with my professor, who we had a conversation when I met him once about how the English department really treats the English classes as for English majors, and that he's sometimes frustrated with how it kind of overlooks and makes it difficult for other majors to be able to write. And so do you have comments on that?
This has a little bit what you were saying about, I think what we're missing sometimes is, and one of the things that I hope to maybe do from on forward is that the appreciation of poetry is something that is also an art. So there's a lot of focus on writing poetry, becoming a poet, but the appreciation of poetry is something that also has its own art in the way of teaching it. And so that's why I try and visit even from grade schools, and there's great teachers that know how to put poetry together, and there's some that are not. But how do how do you do that in a classroom and not sort of want to make a writer out of little Johnny, you know, but just appreciate poetry? There's a similar story as yours, which was a great experience. I read at the Honors College in FIU almost every year because it's my got 3 degrees from. So a science guy, okay, I don't know, I think he was a biologist who was in the honors course, went on and got a science major. He, a few months ago, he's teaching at Adelpaddle Middle School. He called me because he remembered that one session with the poetry, and he became a fan of poetry. And he was now bringing to the creative writing department a poet that he liked because he reads poetry. And that's a good point. I mean, I think that we have to also, I mean, I'm not teaching right now, but there's a lot of creative writing classes, and I'm not sure we've had that dialogue of how to teach people how just to appreciate poetry in the way that we appreciate painting or music or in other ways. So something I think that I don't have an answer to, but I think that's something I want to work on as we move forward, as I move forward in sort of a cause, if you would.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you,
you.
Richard Blanco.
Thank you.